All right, what's up everyone? I'm Jiwa, founder of ntent.art, and today we're going to talk about how to talk about generative art. So who can tell me what type of art this is? Go ahead. Anyone? No? Okay. What about what type of art this is? Okay. And then how about this? All right, so generative art is our newest art movement. 5, 10, 20, 50 years from now, generative art will be formally taught in art history courses. But what exactly about generative art will be in those overpriced university textbooks? Code is native. So society today revolves around technology. Smartphone this, smart that. It's still crazy to me that people use paper maps when driving around town. So since art reflects culture and culture reflects art back, it makes perfect sense that our newest art movement is technology centric. So as a baseline for generative art, for art to be considered generative, it needs to touch code or programming in some way. And the people partaking in this movement, whether you're a dev or not, need to be at least open-minded towards interfacing with technology. And that's as a baseline. But, and this of course gives us a more technology-forward culture. But it's more than just that. Because to put the time investment in learning this space and investing in the space, you have to believe. You got to have a bit of faith. And this space is still nascent, even though some of us kind of forget that sometimes. So in believing that this is here to stay and it's not a fleeting thing, we're all part of the techno cult, which leads to us having a techno culture aspect to the space in general. And along with any art movement, the culture is ingrained with the visuals that you're seeing. So of course, NFTs provide a native home for generative art because they're both rooted in code. And since this knowledge-based barrier to entry exists, we need to have discussion with our peers both in and out of the space, but more importantly out of the space, because that's how we grow the space. And growing the space benefits us all. As CryptoPunk6529 says, we need to onboard 100 million users because a decentralized network is only as good as all of the decentralized people that are a part of it. So this is where today's talk comes in. As a generative artist myself, I've talked at NFT NYC, NFT LA, South by Southwest, across the United States, Portugal, and of course here in Berlin about generative art. And what people know as and call generative art varies pretty greatly, you'd be surprised. So today we all get on the same page. So a little bit about myself. I'm Jiwa, founder of ntent.art. I'm a software engineer for over 15 years. My last real job, I was creating apps for Hollywood in Los Angeles. My first exposure to crypto was Bitcoin in 2013. And in early 2017, January 2017, I opened up my Coinbase and I saw this new thing in there, Ethereum. There was only Bitcoin and Ethereum at the time. So I go deep, do my research, I go to the Bitcoin forums, bitcointalk.org, I go to ethereum.org, and I really get the feeling that this is something new. And yeah, there's that belief that kind of comes into it. So I was living in California, I was in a terrible relationship. Luckily, that relationship ended, and I moved out of my apartment and into my Acura SUV with my dog. And I was traveling the country, programming still with my full-time job, and doing crypto, waking up in the middle of the night to participate in ICOs from around the world. So I was 1,000% part of the techno cult. Around mid to end 2017, I quit my job, went and traveled the world, and went fully in 100% into crypto. That didn't last too long because 2017 ended. As soon as 2018 came around, the bull market was over, crypto began its descent to losing 95% of its value, and I had to go back to work. I had to get a job. So instead of getting another formal job or whatever, I decided to start a creative agency. And I started that creative agency with Dr. Banner back there, who's been emceeing a lot of these stages. Yeah, so we spent the next year and a half creating a generative video system to help sustainable businesses compete with their unsustainable counterparts. And yeah, in creating content, social media content. So then early 2021 popped around and NFTs came onto the scene. And I realized for the past year and a half, I had been building a generative video NFT factory before I even knew what an NFT was. So I let my contracts run out and we decided to go into NFTs full time. And we founded ntent.art, myself, Banner, and Blue Moon. So here are some of my works. This first piece on the left is Dissipation. I'm a meditator and practice yoga and mindfulness. And you know, in the NFT space in particular, there's all these shiny things, all this generating all this FOMO all the time. But in life in general. So this piece was specifically about letting in all these shiny things, letting them pass quickly through our consciousness, and dissipating. It's interactive, you can click on it, it changes, and it also has this kind of hand-drawn vibe with the eyes. My next piece was a fundraiser I did for Ukraine called Fuck Putin. And I filmed these videos at a protest here in Berlin. And this piece was in 3 stages, in 3 acts. So in Act 1, there was a button right here. And you would mint the NFT on Ethereum, and you could share that NFT out across social media. It was a social live experiment. So when you shared that NFT, people could click the button inside the NFT, a pop-up window came, they could enter their ETH address, and choose a word that was generatively populated from the 4-piece manifesto. That was Act 1. On Act 2, I took all of those words that were entered in from the community, the NFT community at large. I created an animated generative alphabet that I could then use to generatively spell out words. And then I spell out the words that were selected within each NFT by the community on the Ethereum NFT as the final piece. So then I updated the final piece to include all the words that were entered within it. And then Act 3 is coming, and everyone who entered their ETH address and just clicked a button for free is going to receive a Polygon NFT that's like a shadow version of the NFT they interacted with. And this piece is a piece I'm releasing on FX Hash next week. It's my introduction to the Tezos and FX Hash community. And it's a collection of photos that I took of myself in 2017 when I was traveling. I drew on the photos, and this is what I kind of call my generative self-portrait. So enough about me. Back to generative art. So, to understand how to talk about generative art and the terms that will be used in art history books going forward, we kind of have to understand the historical context of where we came from. So let's do a little generative art history speed dating class. So pre-generative, and before computers even existed, Emma Kunz was creating what we call geometric abstraction. And if you look at FX Hash art blocks, most of what you'll see there kind of has like a geometric abstraction type of vibe. And that's like the industry term, right? But she was doing it way before it was cool. And she was a spiritual woman. She didn't even see her work as fine art, but we see it as fine art today, of course. She saw it as a tool for healing and for spiritual growth. Next we have Attila Kovacs. And Attila was a pioneer of abstract minimalist art, considered to be the first to use mathematically programmed processes, creating code and algorithms. But he didn't create algorithms for computers to use, he created algorithms for humans to reproduce his works with like precise accuracy. So a pretty cool quote by Attila, he thought very analytically, he was very ahead of his time, and something he said was, the parameters determining the image format, the informational structure of the image is not visible, but the form resulting from the informational structure becomes visible. This information organizes the material into a structure, into a form. So he's talking about a generative process to create art, which was extremely novel at the time. Next we have Vera Molnar. She bridges our discussion between pre-generative and generative. She created her first works that were kind of a geometric abstraction vibe in 1940 with a pen. And then in 1968, she created her first work with a computer that was printed on a pen plotter. She was one of the first to make indeterminate forms that were more chaotic than precise geometry, and one of the first to create, first generative artists to create more hand-drawn qualities with her work. Like most artists of the time, and really pre-NFTs, she curated her best pieces out of a large number of outputs. And then finally, we have Charles Surrey. Charles Surrey is stated by the Smithsonian as being the father of computer animation. He pioneered a ton of techniques, including morphing, 3D art and animations. He created tons of tooling from the ground up to create systems so that he could create multiple different types of artworks. And he considered himself to have a creative partnership with the computers and the software that he wrote. So back to how we talk about generative art. So I kept this simple. This could get pretty complicated pretty quickly, but I kept it really simple, and this is the one takeaway that I'd really like for you to take away from this talk in particular. So at the top, we have generative art, which breaks down to kind of two major categories: illustration-based generative art and algorithmic-based generative art. Illustration-based is, of course, the Bored Apes, Moonbirds, Gutter Cat Gang, all that stuff. But illustration does not necessarily equal PFP projects either. There are some really cool illustration-based pieces, and by illustration-based, I mean illustrators make components that then use code, which is because code is essential to generative art, use code to then combine those illustrated components into the final pieces. So, but yeah, there's some pretty cool illustration-based projects called Art of Seasons and The Hours by Dunn. I think Dunn is being featured in the exhibition below, that aren't PFP projects, but they're certainly like illustration-based, semi-multimedia artworks. And then, of course, we have algorithmic art, which is our general kind of topic for today. We're keeping a focus more so on that. And it breaks down into many sub-niches. We're going to talk about some of those words. But as far as high-level process is concerned, it breaks down into two major categories, and that's curated and long-form algorithmic art. Curated, we already kind of talked about. That's when the artist generates a bunch of different outputs and then selects the best pieces that they feel embodies their work for display and for exhibition. But long form, which is a term that's been popularized by Tyler Hobbs, who created Fidenza, long form generative art, anything that the algorithm produces is a part of the collection. So there is no curation step from the artist. The artist has to test and test and test the algorithm to make sure undesirable outputs don't come out in the final collection, which is a pretty tough process when you're creating like randomized algorithmic art. So a collection can be seen, a long-form collection can be seen as only being as good as its like worst piece. And most of what we see on art blocks and FX hash is like long-form generative art. But there's a term that I've been using lately that's a little easier to say, and yeah, it's called live generative art. And it can be live algorithmic generative art, but for short, I just say live generative art. And that basically says that the art is is code running live as you're looking at it. The art is being generated in front of your eyes as you look at it. It's not a JPEG, it's not a video, it's live running code. And curated algorithmic art can be live. There was a 1-1 piece by Nicholas Sassoon that was just auctioned on Tezos. That was a 1-1 live generative piece, but it wasn't long form because it was just a 1-1 curated piece. And then again, most of what you see on FX Hash is like live long form generative art. The dissipation piece and the fuck Putin piece that you saw earlier, as well as the other one, they're all live generative art. A few other words and context, sub-niches within how generative art is created. Of course, what machines and computers do best, repetition, is used. And within that, you have recursion and modularity. Modularity is when you have a single type of shape that is repeated in a modular structure. It's done a lot with like 3D printed stuff. You can do some really cool modular stuff there. Transformation and morphing. Transformation is like anytime you put like a brightness filter or any kind of filter that you use on Instagram or whatever, it's using math and algorithms to transform that piece of that photo or that piece of art. Transcoding is when you take an output that's data that's output in one format and you transcode it to be output in a different format. So if you convert a PNG to a JPEG, you're transcoding that piece. We've seen like evolving art, generative art that evolves over time, kind of like Gazers by Matt Kane, as well as some illustration-based generative art where they use updating the token URI in the smart contract to evolve the piece over time. Of course, we see data visualization for like charting and inputting data to visualize in a graphic way, and simulation, so simulating the real world with computers through the art. So here's some examples. So this is a cool example of repetition where it doesn't even really feel like repetition. Daisy Bell by Jennifer Steinkampf. And she uses these floral pieces with pretty strong repetition, but it has this natural inorganic vibe. Here is a obviously pretty clear repetition example. Repetition can also be used to pull in the user or the viewer and give kind of like this optical illusion type of vibe as well. So just to illustrate recursion, so recursion is repetition, but when the output of the last step is the input for the next step. So we start with a flat line, and then we just say like, put a point in the middle of this line. And we use then that to feed into the next one. And we say, well, put a point in the middle of all the other straight lines. And as you continue to do that, you can actually end up at some pretty organic forms that kind of look like a leaf. And that kind of reinforces the fact that our natural world is also governed by rules and laws, physics, which is kind of interesting. So here's some transformation examples where you can, in this case, the artist layered low opacity pictures of a city to kind of capture, in my opinion, like the chaos of the city. And it can also be used to kind of distill out like these raw forms and these raw energies where, you know, we can't really see the person in that photo, but because of our culture and the way we grow up, we know that it's Santa Claus, right? Any kind of glitch effect, all of that kind of like electro type of stuff that you see on screen in all your favorite techno shows is all transformation examples. Any ASCII art is a numerical transformation where you're taking that pixel data and transforming it into a numerical piece. And here is an example of transcoding. This data came from a random access memory from RAM in a computer and then was visualized in this kind of way. So that's an example of transcoding data meant for one use but into another viewable form. Visualization, this is kind of maybe a nicer, prettier example of what we might see as like these data heat maps that we see a lot in business. But it can also be a very abstract visualization where data is behind it, but you don't really know what the data is about. You just more so get an energy that the artist is trying to convey. Here's a pretty cool simulation example. It's called Being Not Truthful, and the artist simulated over a couple pieces the degradation of a spider web. So obviously spider web being a natural form. And here we have a very technical name, multi-scale radially symmetric Turing patterns, which you would never really think would come out to a pretty organic cellular form. So again, simulating what an organic cellular form might look like, but with computers. A couple other terms that probably most of you know, probably the most important is deterministic or determinism. When you do a long form collection, there's a level of randomness that is put into the piece to create a long collection, a large collection. But when you buy a token and you refresh that page, it's the same token every time. So that's deterministic. It's deterministic because you can expect the same outcome every single time you look at that piece. This is usually done by injecting the transaction hash from the minting event into the piece, which is cool because it kind of it's you, the creator, the minter of the piece, have an interaction with the piece in creating the piece. You minting it, that transaction hash ends up creating the piece. So you take part in the creation of that piece. Code that is on the blockchain, impermanent forever, is on chain, and some of the technologies that are used to do that, IPFS and Arweave, are the permaweb. And for your generative projects, it's good to make sure that they're stored on the permaweb so you know that they'll live forever. So back to our initial pieces. We can look at this piece by Charles Surrey, and we can call it a curated algorithmic generative piece that was printed with a pen plotter. This Fidenza by Tyler Hobbs, we can call a live, long-form algorithmic generative piece, or a live generative art, or long-form generative art. And this is, of course, illustration-based generative art. So now you can talk a little bit more about generative art at your next metaverse dinner party. But how do you view generative art that's interactive, and how do you interact with it? So we see art displayed on TVs and on projectors, but a lot of this art is interactive. You can click on it, you can play with it. So how do you interact with art that's being displayed in a gallery setting? Well, I suggest you to check out tv.ntent.art. I have an experiment with my dissipation piece that's for gallery viewing, where users can use their phone, turn their phone into a remote control. And I think as we're trying to get generative art in the hands of more people and viewed in a grander stage, it's important to not have specific technologies that are needed to interact with generative art, which is why I like the idea of turning something you have in your pocket as a way of interacting with generative art that's projected on a larger screen. So what comes next? I have no idea, but I'm super in for the ride. I'm going to be creating a lot of cool stuff in that wave, and yeah. So again, I'm Jiwa. Thank you all so much. You can find me at jiwa.art and check out some of the cool stuff that we're minting on our own minting platform that I built at ntent.art/app.